Hello, everybody. Good to see you all. Very excited to introduce Dr. Herman Vargas Gutierrez here today. Herman got his PhD from the University of Minnesota in biological sciences. He was a NOAA postdoctoral scholar with Bill Andereg's group, University of Utah. And his work, I find it fascinating, combines, classic ecophysiology, some field experiments, process-based modeling. I'm excited to see some of the conversations of what's happening in the world of ecophys today, and and I encourage you all to ask your questions and interact with Herman. Just reminding everybody, after this we'll have trainee lunch to talk to Herman and discuss more about his research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vargas. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well in the back? Cool. Awesome. So thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you very much, Katya. I know Katya from my time in Utah, and it has been fun to visiting this morning. And I'm going to talk about plant hydraulics and how we try to capture that diversity in plant hydraulics, how we can start understanding ecosystem processes at the forest level in the particular context of tropical forests. Before I go into what are plant hydraulics and how we measure it, I want to share a life experience with you all about a time in my life that I was just living in this place in the forest. This was even before grad school, but it was a very important time in my career because I got to see firsthand the effects of what an extreme drought event means in a place that is dear to my heart. So this is in the northwest of Costa Rica. I grew up in Costa Rica. I'm from Costa Rica, and this is a fascinating ecosystem. It's called the seasonally dry tropical forest. And in 2015, from 2014 to 2016, more or less, we had like the strongest El Nino southern installation event that created in Central America the strongest drought on record. And I'm gonna go into details on how that Nino was different from other strong El Ninos. But for me, what was really striking, and I'm going to get rid of these Zoom-related things, what was really striking was seeing the amount of destruction that an extreme drought event can do in a tropical forest, especially a tropical forest that you think is adapted to drought, to deal with drought. And these are dead trees of Quercus uloides, which is the tropical live oak. That's what we call it. Or encino if you speak Spanish, and they're all dead. And I went to this plot, let's say 6 months before, and they were all happy and doing well. And of course, in this site, Dan Jansen works, and if you have heard that name before, we asked Dan Jansen, hey, Dan, have you seen this before in Guanacaste? And he was like, no, I haven't seen this before, but oaks died all the time in the US, so it's kind of normal. But then we started looking at the entire forest, and many species were dying too. And so that led a natural curiosity in me as a young scientist in trying to understand how ecosystems and ecological processes respond to disturbances. And when you're like in ecology, which many of you are, especially when you talk to your supervisor, they force you to go and read papers from the 70s, 50s, and 30s. And there's this classic paper by Holling, like Buzz Holling, published in the 70s about like ecological stability and resilience. And he pretty much like defined the concept of stability and resilience for ecological processes. And he describes, he gives a couple of examples on how this works. But basically, he describes that systems can have both. They can be stable, they can have high resilience, they can be unstable and have high resilience as well. And basically stability, if you were to see this diagram, means how much the ecosystem can vary as a response to like an extreme event in one domain, in one state of the system. And then resilience was the ability of that system to go back to the same domain. If the system gets pushed up this boundary, then you have a change of domain, and the ability of that system of recovering is pretty much done. Later on, these two concepts were really important in ecological theory, and being part of the University of Minnesota and the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior, you interact with the work of David Tillman a lot. And some of this work and some of the controversial work he had about how diversity mediates stability. And of course, if you're a plant community ecologist, they say this doesn't make sense. But, and especially if you work at the population level. But if you as somebody looking at productivity and more like ecological processes, it makes a lot of sense. And you can like see how diversity really starts like playing a big role in the stability of ecosystems. And this is an example of one of these foundational papers of the 90s on how like the grasslands of Cedar Creek were like more stable to extreme drought in the 80s as a function of species diversity. And he measured stability by measuring the productivity, the biomass of these grasslands. And we're not talking about species composition, because that's where it gets, the concept starts like these relationships start falling apart. But something that he said in that paper is that for this to be true, there should be species that are like basically better at dealing with drought. And so he basically proposed the idea that there should be winners and losers. And those winners are really driving this stability, because those winners are going to take advantage of those losers being out in the ecosystem. With the grassland system he had, it was fairly simple, and he had very limited functional types. But a tropical forest, it gives you the opportunity to really ask these questions and explore who the winners and losers are and how they vary. So that a lot of like what I'm talking today is engulfing this like big objective of mine to investigate the role of plant hydraulic diversity in buffering ecosystem stability in tropical forests. And we're going to talk about three major like areas of research, trying to summarize what I've been doing in these last 10 years. First, we're going to go through a plant hydraulics 101 to get everybody up to speed and how we measure plant hydraulics and how plant hydraulics vary in tropical forests. Then we're going to try to understand how hydraulic traits help us explain processes that happen at the tree level or the forest level and how they respond to extreme events. And then we're going to talk a little bit about like what we're doing right now and trying to understand how we like kind of like capture these responses to water availability at different temporal scales. As I was saying earlier, a lot of this work is in tropical dry forests. For those who have never heard this biome before, being mentioned before, tropical dry forests originally cover like around half of the terrestrial tropics, a larger area than rainforest actually. And it's also the most threatened forest ecosystem in the world, because tropical dry forests tend to sit in what is fertile land and flat land, lowlands in the tropics, very good for agriculture and cattle ranching. And so it's highly threatened, and also it's not like well protected. So we understand very little. One interesting thing about tropical dry forest, if you compare it to wet forest, is that the beta diversity is extremely high. And if you look at this map, you see little patches along the tropics, and the species composition between one side and the other one will be completely different. And that is fascinating, because you might think, oh, we can ask the question whether there is a lot of convergence evolution to certain physiological strategies, if you're a plant physiologist like me. A dry forest is also a fascinating place to study plant hydraulics, because you have this diversity of strategies. And this is in the northernmost dry forest in northern Mexico, in the Sierra de Álamos, where you can see how like the trees that are common in Central America start becoming shorter and shorter and shorter, because it's drier and colder in the winter. But also, this photo is really good in capturing all the different physiological strategies you can see in a tropical dry forest during the dry season. So let's try to understand how these traits that I call plant hydraulics vary, and how we can try to summarize and understand this variation. So for that, we have to go a little bit into the basics on like how plant hydraulics work. And this is a funny thing that like every time you give a talk about plant hydraulics, you have to describe the soil plant atmosphere continuum and how water moves through plants. We have a water potential gradient, which is telling us the tension that is in the xylem. And we measure that tension in megapascals, in which there is a tension that is basically pulling water up from the atmosphere, from the soil to the atmosphere, sorry. As a plant physiologist, we can also simplify this system as a series of resistances that are modifying the flow of water through this gradient of water potential. And And we can, of course, characterize the conductance of each of these components of that resistance. As we have the conductance of the rhizosphere, the roots, the stem, the leaves, and the stomatal conductance at the top. A very easy way to simplify this is using Fick's equation of like flow through a media thanks to a gradient, and then you just divide the flow is the product of the gradient divided by the resistance of the system. If the water tension gets really high, meaning you get really negative water potentials, you start having that like atmospheric pool of water, like what it causes is that the water column will get stretched out and creating embolisms because the tension is very high, and basically it creates, it puts the water under a lot of negative pressure and it starts boiling on its own. And you can do really cool techniques to capture these embolisms in leaves, as I was showing this in this image, in which we're capturing the optical vulnerability to embolism in leaves on Lonchocarpus. This kind of technique is really useful because then you can basically link the formation of embolisms to a given silent tension. And this varies from one species to another one. It's basically an index of how drought resistant the silent of a given tree is or a given plant. And a useful metric we use is the 50% accumulations of embolisms or loss in conductivity, which we derive using a Weibull function like this one over here that describes that like a nonlinear relationship between a loss in conductivity or embolisms and silent tension. So this P50 trait is going to be really important throughout the talk. Another trait that is really important is the water potential through loss point. So through loss point is basically when the cells lose turgency, and you can capture that building pressure volume curves, which are described in this graph. And basically it tells you when the plants are wilting. And when they're wilting, they're closing the stomata, they cannot absorb any more water from the soil. And then it's another really cool trait you can use to characterize drought tolerance. If you put all these traits together, then you can get a better idea of how like the physiological, how they come together and how the physiological strategy that you measure at the leaf level or at the stem level scales up to the plant level to define the drought tolerance of a given species. And we use, in this case, we can use the true loss point as a proxy of this stomatal conductance curve that tells you like basically the margin that there is between when the xylem starts failing and when the plant is basically shutting things off. And some species will have a wider hydraulic safety margin, some species will have a narrower or even a negative hydraulic safety margin, which means the plant is cavitating and is still like trying to use water. And of course, this has been really important because we can understand basically the hydraulic strategies and use these traits to try to map these really important physiological processes that determine how a species respond to drought. And so the first data that I'm going to show today is the data I collected in multiple tropical dry forest sites, taking advantage of that like high beta diversity between sites. So I got the opportunity to go to the dry forest in the interandean valleys of Colombia, the dry forest in the Antilles in Puerto Rico, my home country in Costa Rica, and then the really interesting forests of the Yucatan Peninsula. On those places, I collected data on these 3 traits on 97 species, spanning the grading of like leaf phenological habits. So in dry forests, you tend to see species that shed their leaves during the drying season. Those are like deciduous. And then you have some that sometimes do it, sometimes they don't do it, sometimes they just shed a little bit of leaves. And those we just put into this category called semi-deciduous. And then you have the ones that are really hardy and then they just deal with drought. And the interesting part here is that these phenological functional types are what modelers use to parameterize models in tropical forests and how land-atmosphere interactions work. And so they make assumptions on how the traits that we use to determine how plants are doing photosynthesis vary in this model. So that was a big question of this project. It's like trying to understand whether those assumptions can be made. And when you look at the large geographical scale, considering all these forest sites, you tend to see some variation that makes sense. You tend to see that like evergreen species are more drought tolerant than deciduous species. This is like you have the E for deciduous, EV for evergreen, not the electric vehicle, and you have semi-deciduous. And then you see the evergreens, okay, they're kind of like more drought tolerant, except you sometimes see some things that don't make sense, like semi-deciduous having a more negative turbo loss point, which means they're gonna try to do photosynthesis at lower water potential values, but then they're like the least drought resistance for the perspectives of the xylene P50. And so, and if you try to say that is kind of like a suicidal strategy, like you're gonna try to do as much photosynthesis as you can, keep stomata open, but then you're like exposing yourself to silent failure. If you try to compare across sites, which is like the importance of these generalizations for modeling, you see that the deciduous species tend to have similar traits. And I want you to put attention to the y-axis here when you have the P50, the xylene resistance to embolism. Again, higher values means more drought sensitive. And I want you to put attention to the variation on the y-axis of the evergreen species. Like there is a lot more variation in evergreens. And something that I wasn't pleased is that I didn't have enough data for multiple sites. And I wanted to throw like nice correlations with climate, but I couldn't do it with the 3 sites that I was able to do these comparisons back then. So I did data synthesis, and I like gathered data from all the tropical forests that have been published data on these traits. In this case, is the turbo loss point, the P50, and the KS means the hydraulic conductivity of the xylem. And so I gathered all this data, and I link these values to the species distribution. So I use the species distributions to characterize their climatic niche. And so basically from occurrence data from herbarium, you can know where the species are more likely to be there, like running a species distribution model. And you get like a sense of what is the aridity that is more likely to occur. And so, and then we link the traits to that variation in the species climatic niches. And what we saw for at least turbo loss point and P50, the one I'm showing results here. So in the aridity index, you tend to have more arid spaces closer to 0. This is wetter. And I'm showing relationships to those where the effect of the relationship is greater than 0. So you have, it comes from a Bayesian hierarchical model, so we're not gonna call it like a significant relationship, but there is evidence there that this trend is real. And so we didn't find that evidence for deciduous species. And something that was very interesting that is kind of in line with the previous study is that if you were to break this by biome, you have from deserts to tropical moist forest, what you see is that there is a way to be a deciduous tree, but there is not a way to be an evergreen tree. And this has implications for models because it means that now we have to gather more data to better inform models to capture this variation in hydraulic strategies that determine productivity in tropical forests. At the end of the day, this is kind of like a summary of these 2 studies in which you can see how like these 2 strategies will converge in wet forests, but they will diverge in dry forests. But like I wasn't happy there. I wanted to explore more like of these relationships, and I wanted to scale up to the forest community level. And sadly, that is really hard to do for entire tropics because usually you're very limited in the number of species you can sample. But there is a tropical island in the Caribbean that has an amazing resource, which is the forest inventory analysis data that you can basically use to map, to have an idea of the plant community. But if you collect enough data of the traits in the species that are present in those plots, you can characterize what we call the community means of those traits and how they vary in this ecosystem. So I did that. I went back to Puerto Rico. I collected a lot of more hydraulic traits. That is right now focusing in my data collection in the wet side of the island, which is in the northeast. If you see that map, it shows the distribution of rainfall in the island. Before I was in the southwest of the island, in the dry area, which is shown here by the Guanica State Forest photo. And then I collected these traits in as many species as I was able to be able to calculate community weight of means. And in this other map, what you see is the value through the loss point, depending on the plant community, and the size of the dots reflect how much confidence we have in those observations because we were able to capture the composition of the species there. So the interesting results that we find here, well, we confirm what we saw in the previous studies with aridity, but more importantly, what we saw is that like this effect of stand age, in which drought tolerance seems to increase in older stems, but it occurs differently, at least for the perspective through the loss point, depending if you are in a wet forest or in a dry forest, which is really interesting. These results, I got really excited about it because when you're like, this was during my postdoc, and I was writing the paper, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then you go into the literature, and nobody has shown this before. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And so you take advantage of that tropical opportunism of finding this new pattern in which like stand age becomes a really strong driver of drought tolerance. I want to highlight that the drought tolerance values are absolute here. So basically higher values mean more drought tolerance, and that's why you see these positive effects in these models. So with this idea in mind, now like we're really curious to understand how like the stand age and forest succession mediate variation in hydraulic traits and how that scales to demography. And that's something my grad student Sophia is working on right now, is trying to like think outside this like leaf phenology box, which we show is not really good in explaining variation in these traits, and try to understand more from the perspective of how these species are competing in their forests. And in tropical forests, and this applies sometimes for forests here in the Pacific Northwest, you might have heard that like Douglas fir is a long-lived pioneer. And so it's like this idea that as succession goes by, you have different guilds of plants competing for light and competing for resources. And some of those species, like the slow ones in this graph, will be better in the older states of the forest, and some other species will be better at the beginning because they're really good at competing, and some are in the middle. And so we're starting to look at this variation and how these traits vary as a function of this from demography functional types. We're doing this in multiple forest sites, but this is just like a preview of what we see in the forest I've been working in northwestern Costa Rica, in which like very interestingly, the slow growing species that we were expecting, oh, those are like the evergreens that grow in the understory. They should be more drought tolerant, but they are not. And interestingly, you see that the long-lived pioneers and the fast-growing species are the more drought tolerant, which doesn't make sense in my head when I think about drought tolerance and how costly these traits are for plants to build. But they are like somehow in this forest being fast-growing and also drought tolerant. I wanna make put the asterisk here that the forests we work are dominated by legumes. And tropical legumes, if you have been to a tropical forest, they are usually really dense in their wood. A lot of the precious woods we use, like purple heart, is a tropical legume. And they have also drought tolerance, but they also grow really fast because they have extra nutrient ability and abilities to capture more carbon and use that carbon more quickly. So now we're going to transition to try to understand ecological processes and try to like see this prediction that Dave Tillman made with the grassland experiment and see whether this holds true for tropical forests. And so we're trying to answer this question: how do hydraulic trees explain tree level and forest level responses to extreme events? And we're going to focus again in the ENSO, in that like moment of my life that changed forever, and try to understand these patterns of tree mortality. When I was a grad student, I was beginning my grad school. My advisor was like, you know, all those trees die. Well, let's try to like figure out why. And so we started working together in this project, and like it ended up being like me collecting a lot of traits like frantically to try to publish this idea really quick or as quick as possible because it seemed very important at the moment and it still is. And so this work comes from northwestern Costa Rica. This is the Santa Rosa National Park and Palo Verde National Park. These are photos of what the forest looks like, two like sections of the forest that are more on the old growth side of things. Something interesting about Palo Verde is that alluvial deposition forest is very high in nutrients, but it's also at the same time is karst forest, soils that were uplifted when the isthmus got formed. Well, in Santa Rosa, you have a lot of volcanic ash deposition from the nearby volcanoes. So there they have different soils, and usually the ones in Palo Verde are more nutrient rich. And so I wanted to describe the big El Nino. And for those not familiar with El Nino, the Nino is this global climate system that happens every other year, but like used to be every 5 years or every 3 years. That like we see warming in the Pacific Ocean. And that warming, what it generates is a lot of energy that changes that warming occurs because of change in the speed of winds, but also changes the distribution of humidity in the Earth system. And something that happens here in the Pacific Northwest during El Niños is that we have more frequency of Pineapple Express storms. But right now we're in La Nina cycle and we have less Pineapple Express because there's less energy being generated by the Pacific Ocean. These cooler waters. For the forests that we work in Guanacaste, in Costa Rica, what we saw during El Nino, and I wanted to put attention at this graph, which is a complicated graph, and my apologies for that. But you have the two sides. On the y-axis, which describes the bars, is the water deficit we saw in a given year. That's just how much less water the site is getting when you compare to the 30-year normal. And then on the y-axis, on the right side, you have the rainy season length. How many days of rain you have in a given year. And in a seasonal system like this one, this is really important because this is basically the growing season of those trees. And so if we focus on the water deficit, something that makes this Nino that happened in 2014 and 2016 very different, that you see a gradual increase in the water deficit. We had a really strong El Nino in 2023, I want to say, but we didn't have this gradual increase in water deficit. And at the time, we were talking with Tim Broderick of plant physiology from Australia, and he was like, oh, but that's very gradual. I think hydraulic failure just happens because it's really dry. But when you see this, you see like there's probably something going on in the soil that like leads to this water deficit to be more severe. On top of that, you see a gradual decrease in the rainy season that like culminated between 2015 to 2016, that we have the shortest rainy season on record and the highest water deficit on record. So this is really important because it put into context what we saw. Oh no, I went too fast. So what we saw was like an increase in mortality rates. Another complicated graph. I want you to focus on the y-axis on the left, which describes the mortality rates in the bars. This dotted line represents the average. This is normal for tropical forests. You see around 2.7, 2.6% mortality in across size classes. But that year we saw this giant spike in these 2 years in mortality, which like it's telling us something is changing, and something changed in a way that we don't fully grasp a complete understanding of what is going on. So the common thing to do in a tropical dry forest is look at leaf habits. Evergreen species more drought tolerant, deciduous species less drought tolerant. But it seems if you look at this graph, I plotted here on 50 species, you see that it's all over the place, which is summarized in this box plot in the top, in which you have the three leaf habits, and it doesn't really explain the patterns of mortality. What is really interesting is there is definitely some winners and some big losers over there. And those species I want you to put into context those numbers, because the mortality rate we capture as the number of individuals that were dead as a function of the individuals that were alive before the ENSO. So that means from like Sebastiana pavoniana, which is the species at the very top, like we saw around 35% of all the trees we counted were dead, which is a big number. Another classical ecological plant ecophysiology theory is that larger larger trees or bigger trees are more sensitive to drought. Just because you think a tall tree, you have more hydraulic pressure built, and so the tension is higher, and so more embolism forms. We didn't really see that. And in fact, most of the trees that we saw a lot of mortality were like smaller, on the smaller size. Something I want to highlight here that our data comes from like secondary tropical forests. So you have overrepresentation of the smaller trees compared to big old growth forest trees. What I found really interesting in some species like Apeiba tiburbu, which we call the monkey comb, because the fruit looks like a brush that a monkey will use. You do see the classic thing you expect, higher probability of mortality in larger trees. Some other species, you see the opposite. And this might be a function of the mechanism of mortality, because it could be that these species have shallower roots. Just think a smaller tree will have shallower roots. That like allometry makes sense sometimes. But then in this case, it could be that this tree, that the taller tree will actually experience higher hydraulic tension. What we found really interesting is that the only few traits that were able to explain the variation in mortality rates were the P50 and the hydraulic safety margin. And this, if you ask a plant physiology and somebody who works in plant hydraulics, wouldn't be surprised about this, because you have seen this kind of relationship in temperate forests, at least for pine systems, and in eucalyptus as well. But this is the first time this was shown for a tropical forest, and especially a tropical dry forest. So it was a revelation at the moment. And something interesting here is that like none of the classic functional traits people use were able to explain those mortality patterns. So like it highlights the importance of understanding the variation of hydraulic traits, which means job security for me, but also at the same time, it highlights like that there's a mechanism going on in this case of this mortality event. And that mechanism is probably related to hydraulic failure. So now we go to the exciting part of the talk that is like more related to what we're doing right now, and how we're trying to understand this last idea, this other idea from in which some species will take advantage of like the failure of others, and just thinking of species are competing with each other. And so can we really capture this in the way plants are responding to water availability? Is the big question we want to answer here. And so for that, we're using growth to look at interannual scales. And there's two main ideas here that, like, as I said, larger trees are expected to be more vulnerable to drought, but also those trees, relative to their size, they put less growth relative to the size. If you spend the absolute value of biomass, they're putting more biomass just because they're bigger. But like growth rates tend to slow down as trees get bigger. And this is work that I've been working with Justin and Christina. Those are friends now that I met through grad school, and we were working in. Justin started the plots in 2008, and now we're getting excited because we're coming to like almost 10 years, almost 20 years of this data. That is a problem too from an ecology perspective, because you're always, oh, for one more year of data can get a better story. And you keep adding that, and then you never publish your results because each year becomes better. So what we're doing here is to try to characterize the effects of tree size on growth. We're measuring growth using band dendrometers. As I said, the data I'm showing here is from 2008 to 2019, but now we're incorporating data to 2025. And we're using a basic hierarchical model that basically tells it assumes a negative relationship between relative growth rate and tree size, in which larger trees will have slower relative growth rates. With this, you can basically characterize this tau metric, in which tells you the sensitivity of the growth rate to climate or the conditions that are going on. And when you look at the whole span of a species and compare that tau characteristic for a given year. So knowing that like the ENSO had a shorter growing season, the really strong enso. So our first hypothesis was like, well, it should be the growing season length should be really important. And this is not a surprising result. I mean, we were expecting this variation. We were expecting that if a tree has more days to grow, the whole forest should like grow more, right? And then over there you have the growing season during enso, in which trees have very little, a shorter growing season, and they overall show like slower growth rates. And this held both for both sides, Palo Verde and Santa Rosa. These are aggregated to the forest level. So these are like the average relative growth rates for each year for each side. Then what is really interesting for this kind of model is that you can actually characterize how those effects are different depending on the size of the tree, which really allows us to tell us this question of like, oh, are larger trees actually more sensitive to drought in this system? And here you have the tau, which is again is the sensitivity to growth season. And what we see is like the smaller trees are more sensitive to the growing season length. So the smaller trees will benefit from this longer growing season, while the older trees or bigger trees, they don't seem to have a real effect between whether the years is long, the growing season is longer or shorter. And we think this is related to rooting depth, a trait that plant hydraulics tend to avoid. We tend to assume trees grow from the soil up, because just roots are really hard to sample. If somebody works here with roots, probably understand that. And we cowardly just go retreat to our silent branches and assume that whole tree is a representation, that a branch is a representation of the tree. But what you can see here is that like probably rooting depth is actually having a really important effect in how these trees grow and across different size classes. And this sensitivity, it also ties back to the mortality results that I showed earlier. I mean, we saw that smaller trees were experience higher mortality rates. And we see from this data that it makes sense from the perspective of these trees being more sensitive to the available water. The last result, and again, hydraulic safety margin, which is this difference between trigger loss point and P50. Now we have more data for more species. And as you can see, how it really explains the sensitivity of growth to the growing season length, meaning that species that are in a more safer strategy tend to be able to take advantage of that available water. And these are species that tend to have shallower roots, more avoidance, drought, physiological strategy. And it makes sense. And also a lot of these species are more drought deciduous. It makes sense why they will be more sensitive to water availability. That is species that are more living on the edge, getting ready to tolerate drought. A bonus track of the work I've been doing in Puerto Rico is that I put together a cool data set with Tristan Allerton, and we try to understand this perspective of like, what happens after a big hurricane? Which like trees recover faster, and like we put together our two data sets in which he had some metrics of resprouting relative growth rates and drought avoidance through the stomatal conductance during the dry season, and I have my plant hydraulic traits. And we found that like basically trees are more hydraulically efficient and avoid drought, tend to take advantage, have more resprouting relative growth rates, explaining like hurricane recovery and which trees are gonna increase in biomass after hurricanes, which was really interesting. And but this is like, if you ask a plant physiologist, you will say, yeah, but you're looking at interannual variation and a tree is doing a lot of things during the growing season. You're not really looking into physiological processes, or you cannot say those conclusions about rooting depth and sensitivity to water with that confidence. And for that, sadly, you have to use plant water status or plant hydraulic regulation to actually capture this kind of data. Who here has ever measured water potentials? 3, 4 people. Okay, do you understand the pain of waking up at 3 a.m. to go to a forest plot to get the pre-done water potential? And so, but the interesting thing is that water potentials, if you collect enough of them, you can characterize the hydraulic behavior of a species. You can know if the species is downregulating stomatal conductance to keep water potential stable. And you can also know if the species is basically having a more exploitative use of water and just keeping a stomatal conductance and allowing more negative water potentials to, or high silent tension to occur. And this is work led by my postdoc, Justine Rojas, which she has been working a lot with hydraulic regulation. And we're trying to understand if we can actually measure this without going to the forest, which will be really nice. and the reason is because measuring water potential is challenging in terms of like you have to wake up early, but also you have to carry, if you want to do it like get enough data, you have to carry a bunch of those tanks. And I used to do the not safe thing of taking the big nitrogen tank. Don't tell my university that, but I take the small ones. Yeah, but this will last me the entire day for very dry periods. The small ones will like run out by noon, and you have to like take a bunch of them. So at the end of the day, it makes more sense to take a big tank. And but the cool thing, as I was saying, you can really see the regulation of the silent tension. And here I'm showing the species that have different patterns of hydraulic regulation. And for these ones, we have data on roots because a colleague of mine actually dug up whole trees to know how deep the roots are. And so it's really cool. We were able to pick a species that we know how deep the roots are. And so you have the evergreen species that is drought tolerant, but also have deep roots, which means probably those data of water potential means it's not being exposed to drought because it has access to water. You have the silver species that is actually shutting down stomatal conductance and keeping hydraulic, the water potential is really stable over the growing season. And this makes sense because it's a drought avoidant species with shallow roots. And then you have a species that just doesn't care. And it has shallow roots, it has a really resistant xylem, and it's one of those species that the hydraulic safety margin is very narrow. And as you can see here, it's been exposed to a higher silent tension. This is not during an ENSO year. This is a normal year that we use to collect this data. And you probably are asking, how is this guy trying to measure this without going to the forest? And so what we're using is the power of microwave radiation. And microwave radiation, especially the ones that you have in your pockets right now with your cell phones, communicate with satellites through what we call the L band. And when you think about radiation from like microwaves and radiometers, there's different bands and they have different penetration depths into media. The L band is one of those that can penetrate the forest canopy you have and goes all the way to the ground. And it's very similar to what you have in cellular networks, and that's why we can talk on the cell phone from a room like this one. Same thing, but cellular networks usually use the P band, which has even more power than the L band. But the cool thing is that you can put a bunch of antennas for GPS, like this one. It's a very simple system. You just need a strong battery and a data logger and the antennas under the canopy. And if you have one antenna above the canopy, then you isolate how much of the noise in that radiation is due to the canopy. And so the idea here is that like we can isolate how much of that noise, or the signal to noise ratio, is due to the water in the vegetation because of the sensitivity of the L band to moisture. And so the data looks like this. This is for one single satellite communicated with the antenna. And you can see how the satellite moves in the sky. And then you can get a delta of the signal to noise ratio of the satellite communicating with the antenna, which you can use to calculate canopy transmissivity. And once you know canopy transmissivity, you can calculate what we call the vegetation optical depth, which is this metric of how the moisture in the vegetation is attenuating the signal of microwaves. And so we use this first to compare the growing season data. So this is just signal to noise ratio between the dry season and the wet season. You have here the semi-deciduous, deciduous, and the evergreen forest. And you can see there's differences, especially in the deciduous one. That's why you see a red color more. And then you see less clear difference with the evergreen, but you still see some differences. Another way to visualize this data is more, and that is more appealing to the human eye, is by using these Henny plots. And as you can see, whatever is green has a lot of vegetation, whatever is darker, it has very low signal to noise ratio values. And these are the canopy colors, and these are how it varies through the growing season. And as you see, there is like a bunch of peaks and downs. So we're trying to capture right now that, like, how to quantify that variation in those peaks and downs and link into the water potential regulation. But this is work in progress, but we're really excited about, because we're starting to see that we can actually see some difference between the three functional types, which, as I showed at the beginning, they have different hydraulic regulation strategies. So in summary, like, ecosystem stability and its linkages to ecosystem development are highly dependent of what is like driving community composition, and basically the assembly of those plant communities and its functional composition. I mean, there's winners and losers, but those winners and losers depends on their physiology. And we can understand those processes of natural selection, and we can like use plant traits for that, but we need to really pick wisely which traits for a given selective pressure. You're not going to pick hydraulic traits to think about like how the plants use nutrients, of course, and or how they compete for light, if that example is clear enough. I want to end this talk to like first thank all my funding sources from like the Department of Energy that funded a lot of the work on my PhD, the University of Minnesota, Forest Service, NSF, NOAA, and the Wilkes Center at the University of Utah. And then, of course, all of this work was not done by myself. And this is like the fun part for me of like being a scientist, especially a tropical ecologist, to go to all these sites and just like look at trees and measuring what they're doing. And like none of this work would have been done if it wasn't because of all these people that was there with me along this journey. I want to also thank you for your attention, for being here, coming to listen what I had to share. And you can always reach out to me and look us up through the Forest Ecophysiology Lab at Oregon State University. I also want to thank my lab, who are great and are awesome. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
There'll also be some questions on Zoom. Questions like that.
Yeah. It was a lot.
Great talk, thank you. Is there possibly data or even anecdotal data to look at whether recruitment rates are inversely correlated with the mortality rates in the forest down there? Is it possible it's just a life history trade-offs, and species with high mortality rates also have higher recruitment rates after those events as well?
We do have data. I didn't show that data here because we're focused on the mortality events. Some of the work by Sophia, we're trying to look and how, because how you characterize these demography groups is you need recruitment for that. And there's supposed to be a turnover in which like a species has a fast recruitment and low mortality in the younger stages, tend to be higher mortality in the older stages. And so we're really interested to understand those turnovers. During the drought, what we saw was an overall low recruitment in general, because the small trees were also dying. Sadly, at that moment, we didn't have the seedlings of the sapling plots, which we regret deeply because it's a really important part of the story. So since probably 2018, we started collecting seedling plots to get that recruitment story, because they're doing something different, and it's where most of the mortality happens. Something that is interesting that I read recently from work coming from BCI is that during these ENSO events, what they saw during the 50-hectare plot is that like a lot of the species that tend to die due to like pathogen or species interactions, kind of like Jansen Connell's story, those pressures go down during drought events. And they suggested that the selection it leans towards like drought selection, so more drought tolerant species will be, but they didn't show data to prove that. So that is kind of like an interesting question we're like trying to answer with the new demographic data we're collecting. Thank you.
Do you end up confirming the Tillman prediction for your voice?
We're working on that. So right now we're putting together a paper looking at, we have data on ecosystem productivity from leader fall baskets, and we also have a program productivity. So we're putting together a paper trying to understand if you have more diversity, you see more or less stability in these fluxes as a function of drought. And so some of the plots, and I would say it depends. Like if you go to the oak plots that are dominated by oaks, you saw a lot of mortality. And it would make sense there, oh, David Tillman was right. But some of the other plots that saw a lot of mortality also were more diverse, and the mortality was more focused in the smaller trees. And that kind of confirmation will get like scattered, and it will be harder to find. So it really depends on the diversity of the system and which species is dominant. So yeah, it's more complicated to what Dave Tillman found in the grasslands.
Quick follow-up question then. When you do your community weighted average representation of that, given that how diverse the system is, so what's percent-wise, how much of the community you actually represent in each of these plots?
Yeah, so in Puerto Rico, we range from 30% was like the lowest to like 90% or 100%, depending on the forest site. In Guanacaste, we are right now at like, I will say like close to 75% across the board. We have data on these traits of like around, for Turgolos Point, we have data in around 70 species. The forest there has a total of around 115. And for P50, we have data on around 60 species. So we feel pretty confident and solid. But this is I've been collecting these traits since 2015. So it's kind of like the product of that, like spending all this time there. Yeah. Yeah. Question in the back.
The sand age of that thing showed.
Yeah.
So how much of that has to do with the diversity of like hydraulic traits in older stands versus younger ones?
Yeah. So the question was how much of the stand age effect is due to the diversity of hydraulic traits versus like of old and young stands? And that is a really cool question. I didn't show those results here. In that Puerto Rico data set, we also look at how the traits vary across stand age. And what is really interesting is that dry forest and wet forest and moist forest, and you can keep putting biome labels in there, they all do a different pattern. And so like a dry forest will start very drought tolerant and comes like as the stand age increases, it becomes less drought tolerant. You have the abundance of more shade tolerant species that depend on like established community. And then on the wet forest happens completely the opposite way. You start with really drought sensitive species that compete a lot for light, and then diversity starts increasing, and you start the appearance of like slow grow, high wood density, high drought tolerance species that like create in these more diverse sites. So like if you were asking this question from the perspective of wet forests, I would say yeah, diversity is really driving a lot of these patterns. And in dry forests, diversity gets simplified a lot because there's a strong selective pressure. And so it's harder to pick up that effect. But it's there. I will say it's there because you see it a little bit in those patterns. Cool.
Well, thank you. Herbert, did I miss that?
Thank you so much.
Sue, I will not be able to join for